Hi folks, welcome to Tales of History and Imagination. My name is Simone. Let's consider today's tale a work in 4 acts. We're going to start with a bang, then look into a series of unexpected outcomes that came from this horrific incident. Act 1 begins early in April 1815 on the island of Java, modern-day Indonesia. Like much of the world, Java had been caught up in the worldwide conflict that was the Napoleonic Wars, having passed from Dutch rule to the French, then back to the Dutch again after 1814. This was via the conquering Britons of 1811. On 13th of August 1814, the Convention of London handed the Dutch back their Indonesian colonies, and just shy of 8 months later they were in the process of taking control, re-establishing themselves in the Dutch East Indies. While it must have been some relief to the Dutch and the English alike that they no longer had to deal with Bonaparte, they realised the Dutch had some way to go to re-establish themselves in their powerhouse trading empire in the Spice Islands. When they heard cannon fire in the distance, they must have wondered who was up to mischief, where and to what end. Soldiers were sent out to deal with whatever militia, rogue Fifth Estaters or interloper was out to dethrone the Dutch. I don't know if these soldiers, presumably British rather than Dutch at the time, fared. I only know Sir Stamford Raffles, founder of Singapore, mentions them in his memoirs. But there was no interloper. Mother Earth was about to king-hit the region with a type of ferocity not seen in a very long time. On April 10th, 1815, the supposed cannon fire was revealed as a prelude to the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia's Lesser Sunda Islands. To say this was a huge eruption is an understatement. It was the biggest volcanic eruption in at least 10,000 years. People talk of a neighbouring Krakatoa eruption of 1883 as a big deal, and well it was, but it was a baby compared to Mount Tambora. Krakatoa happened at a time when telegraphs carried news around the world in the blink of an eye, also at a time when a greater democracy around the world ensured an easier access and an easier spread of news. Tambora was a real news story, at a time when technology simply was not equipped to disseminate information fast enough. So let's try to quantify this eruption. Though it continued to fume and spit out debris from 10th of April until mid-July, most of its payload was released in the first 3 days. In terms of pure power, Mount Tambora went off with an equivalent of 3.3 billion tons of TNT. 2.2 million times the little boy atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. To go full tales of science and imagination for a second. In 3 days, the eruption blew with 1.17 times 10 to the power of 20 joules. Or if you're like me and that makes not a lot of sense, approximately equivalent to 3 months' worth of the whole world's power consumption in our time, in a space of just 3 days. Via 3 massive columns of fire, a plume of smoke which reached 40 kilometers into the atmosphere, and via pyroclastic flows moving at a speed of 160 kilometers per hour, the volcano would eject 175 cubic kilometers of debris. If you collected all the ash in an area the size of Rhode Island, the pile would be close to 56 meters high, almost half the height of Providence, Rhode Island's highest building, its Superman building. Convert that, New Zealand podcast and all that this is, to Auckland, New Zealand. We would be looking at a pile 161 meters high, just under half the height of our Sky Tower, as wide as our super city. It went off with a bang heard 2,600 kilometers away, and left a 14,000-foot-tall mountain with a caldera, a giant indent, over a kilometre deep and a little over 3 kilometres wide. Did this eruption cause widespread death and destruction? Very much so. One source I read claimed 10,000 people died instantly in the blast, near the island and the neighbouring island of Lombok. The blast caused a tsunami which rolled through the Java Sea at a height of around 2 metres. Ash fell on islands as far as 1,300 kilometres away in a significant quantity. Enough so that it would collapse roofs 400 kilometres from the blast with its weight. Acid rain would fall in the region. Water supplies would be poisoned, forests, grasslands and crops would be decimated. and all up perhaps as many as 80,000 further locals would die of starvation in the wake of the eruption. Now I want to be a little careful in this tale, mindful of the fact this is a lot about statistics. It's quite Stalin of all people. 1 death is a tragedy, 1 million deaths a statistic. This, for all the stats, is 80,000 tragedies, a whole lot more when this tale is fully told. One final stat I do want to share, though, is as follows. While Mount Tambora threw a lot of ash into the atmosphere, it also released massive amounts of sulfur, of chlorine and fluorine into the world. This would lead to 1816 becoming known as the year without a summer, as it drastically affected the whole of the planet. For the rest of this episode, the final 3 acts, I want to leave the people of Indonesia, with my love, respectfully, to rebuild and move on, and turn my attention to 3 flow-on effects of this tragedy. Welcome, folks, to Tales of History and Imagination, Season 1, Episode 8, Mount Tambora, a Butterfly Effect in 4 acts. To explain the next chapter in the story, I feel I do need to digress for a second on the topic of the Grand Tour. If you were a young aristocratic man in England, and this really was almost exclusively a boy's thing, growing up in the 17th or 18th centuries, your final stage in preparing for manhood would be going off on the Grand Tour. You would usually spend 6 months wandering the continent, seeing the sights in France and Italy, possibly Spain, some Germanic duchies perhaps, maybe the Balkans, the Mediterranean, or even the Baltic states. This was usually followed by a stay of 3 years in some aristocratic enclave over the continent, to sharpen up your language skills and cultural knowledge. Aristocrats would mix with other aristocrats, sow their wild oats, and eventually return to their estates more worldly wise. The Napoleonic Wars put an end to the Grand Tours, and when they came back into vogue decades later, the spread of railways across the continent and the development of companies like Thomas Cook and Sons, offering cheap package tours, meant it was never going to be quite the same preserve of the wealthy aristocratic few ever again. During the time of the Napoleonic Wars, people really started feeling like they were missing out on some important cultural milestone. Even those who had not participated began to get the itch to travel. No, I don't mean the kind of travel you get as cannon fodder in a war. In 1809, a young aristocrat named George Gordon, titled upon his uncle's death the 6th Baron Byron, an inheritance of title and status but very little wealth, gets a travel bug and sets off on his own grand tour, war or no war. He skips war-torn Europe, opting for the Mediterranean, via Portugal, Spain, Malta, onto the Ottoman Empire in the east. When he returned to Britain in 1811, he began to write long poems of his adventures. And one particularly, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, is a massive hit. In Childe Harold, Byron captures the zeitgeist of a generation sick and tired of endless wars, many in a culture war with their parents' generation. He establishes the Byronic hero, a brooding, mysterious, almost superhero type. For more modern examples, think James Bond or Batman. Most importantly, his poems allow the travel-hungry to live vicariously through him, in a way that HGTV doer-upper shows now allow cash-strapped millennials to ponder on what they would do with some run-down old house. Lord Byron became very rich, super famous, and influential very quickly. He wrote of his success, quote, "I awoke one morning to find myself famous," end quote. I'm digressing to point out Byron particularly was a rock star of his era. Percy Bysshe Shelley, not so much really in his lifetime, but he would be seen posthumously as one of the greatest. Mary Shelley would write several novels. I've only read her most famous one myself, and what a novel that is. So our rock star authors set off for Geneva, Switzerland, early in the summer of 1816. They left behind a bitingly cold, wet, miserable, hazy England. If you look at Joseph Turner's paintings from 1816 to 1818, you really get a sense of the atmosphere. I will post some pictures from Turner in the script of the blog page, historyandimagination.com, if you're interested. Lord Byron set out first, followed a week later by Mary Shelley, still then Mary Godwin, Percy Shelley, and Mary's half-sister, Claire Clairmont. While they would have hoped for warmer weather, they arrived to weather like none of them had ever seen before. Mary would write back to her other sister Fanny, who was back in London, quote, "One night we enjoyed a finer storm than I have ever before beheld. The lake was lit up, the pines on Jura made visible, and all the scene illuminated for an instant, when a patchy blackness succeeded, and the thunder came in frightful bursts over our heads in the darkness." End quote. The unseasonable weather, which would roll on, not having fully cleared from the atmosphere for several years, was caused by the build-up in greenhouse gases from the volcano. In Geneva, spring, then summer did not come that year. The Shelley Circle were greeted by the coldest winter in records, which date back to 1753 in the area, by a howling, incessant northeast wind, by an almost never-ending rain. Geneva saw 130 days of torrential downpours between April and September 1816. It rained so much that year that, despite the snow never thawing and running down the mountains, Geneva flooded. Violent thunderstorms became the norm, which, while not reportedly dislodging the summer snowcaps, left trees strewn about the edges of the lake. On June 13th, 1816, Lord Byron clung onto the balcony, staring nature in the eye. He composed for a later canto of Childe Harold, quote, "The sky is changed, and such a change, O night, and storm, and darkness, ye are wondrous strong. And now again 'tis black, and now the glee of the loud hills shakes with its mountain mirth, as if they did rejoice o'er a young earthquake's birth." Finding themselves seriously at risk every time they ventured out, one day Shelley took out a boat on the lake and was lucky not to drown, perhaps a portent of future things for him 6 years later. They did spend a lot of time indoors. On June 16th, the suggestion was made to the party they should have a competition to write the best Gothic tale. On June 18th, another tempest-tossed night, the party settled around the fireplace, while Lord Byron recited from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's latest book, a collection of older, unpublished pieces which included the Gothic tale Christabel and the Orientalist fragment Kubla Khan. The party took in the vibe of the evening and, truthfully, probably a little bit of opium. Absolutely tripping balls, Percy Shelley ran terrified from the room at one point, where he was sure he'd seen Mary had taken off her top and had eyes where she normally would have nipples. Mary Shelley, however, was letting her imagination run away with her on a whole different level. In the midst of this electrical storm, she began to imagine a young scientist born in Geneva. As he reaches maturity, his mother passes on, and he throws himself into his studies. Obsessed with the thought of being able to bring loved ones back to life, he creates life from the dead, through a secret method which includes a massive jolt of electricity. He is immediately horrified of the monster he has created. To go beyond that, the romantic writers of this era, they had a great love for the concept of the sublime. The sublime is the overwhelming feeling a human gets when faced up against the unstoppable force of nature. Frankenstein has the sublime in spades: stormy nights, majestic mountains, gale-forced winds feeding into the tension of a scene. If you haven't read it, I won't drop any spoilers. Well, okay, just one. From the book. Victor sees a storm. Note the similarities between this and Mary's letter to Fanny. Quote, "We witnessed a most violent and terrible thunderstorm. It advanced from beyond the mountains of Jura. The thunder burst at once with frightful loudness and from various quarters of the heavens. I remained while the storm lasted, watching its progress with curiosity and delight. As I stood at the door, on a sudden I beheld a stream of fire issued from an old and beautiful oak, which stood about 20 yards from the house, and so soon as the dazzling light vanished, The oak had disappeared, and nothing remained but a blasted stump. Looking back at the aftermath of the eruption, it had worldwide ramifications on crops, which led to famine and disease all over the globe. The deaths from starvation have been estimated at around 1 million, but when you add the death toll from disease, especially from the cholera epidemic, which spread much more freely because of this disaster, the death toll in the aftermath may have been as high as 10 million. In China, the unseasonable weather killed off large numbers of trees, of crops, of water buffalo, and of people. Changes in weather patterns caused the Yangtze Basin to flood. This does not seem to be one of the bigger floods the basin has had throughout history, but it certainly added to the misery of a year without a summer. Torrential downpours throughout South and Central Asia allowed localized cholera epidemics to spread like wildfire, all the way from Bengal to Moscow. Europe was at the tail end of a little ice age when Tambora exploded, and this still had massive effects, causing crop failures across the continent. From riots in Switzerland, protests in France, Germany, and Ireland, climate change refugees in Wales packed up their belongings en masse and headed for the towns and cities of England, looking for work. The Irish, still a couple of decades away from a worse famine still, were all the same hit very heavily. 8 weeks of non-stop rain ruined crops, and led to a typhus epidemic across Ireland, which took an estimated 100,000 lives, about half of the lives lost in Europe from the year without a summer. What crops did survive became costly commodities. Now oats were a favourite for horses, much needed for transport and agriculture at this time. Suddenly it became extremely costly to keep a horse. Many horses subsequently had to be put down. In Germany, post-Tambora, necessity proved the mother of invention for a German baron and civil servant named Karl von Drais. Drais was a prolific inventor who tried his hand at numerous inventions, including an early version of a typewriter. He also worked as a forestry official. The responsibility of his job was to go around the forest checking the tree stands, platforms from which hunters could shoot, were still safe. One day, while thinking about how long a distance it was to walk from tree stand to tree stand, Drais comes up with an idea. Now, to say Karl von Drais invented the bicycle is not entirely accurate. In 1790 or 91, a French aristocrat named Comte Mede de Sivrac was reputed to have made the first wooden horse. Named the Celerifer, and later Velocifer, these vehicles were two-wheeled contraptions with no steering at all, and no pedals. This meant sitting across the crossbar and building up momentum by running like you were Fred Flintstone in his car, and then picking your feet up as the bike got some momentum. To turn you had to pull a wheelie and place the wheel back down in the direction you hoped to go for, or slow down and change direction manually. These devices were very popular amongst a set of people who liked to have races along long, straight, paved roads, likes of the French Champs-Élysées. Drais innovated on the Velocifer, adding a turnable front wheel, a padded seat, and padded elbow rests, allowing the rider to put more weight on the vehicle. His bike, first developed in 1817 and exhibited the following year, was called the Laufmaschine, later the Velocipede. On its first test, Drais took the bike out on a 14-kilometre round-trip ride and made the journey in a little over an hour. The Velocipede was definitely a step in the right direction, but it had limited appeal. To develop a new technology is a great thing, but if the infrastructure is not quite there, this itself can prove troublesome. Many of the roads at the time were unpaved and deeply scarred by track marks by the carriages. Riding a velocipede along the more worn roads was quite dangerous. Many figured it would be a lot safer to ride them along the footpaths, and it was safer for the riders, but not so much for the pedestrians. While the dandy horse, as it's sometimes called, enjoyed some initial popularity, safety concerns saw them banned, all the way from the USA to Britain, Germany, parts of India, something we're now seeing in cities around the world with these electric scooters. This did Baron von Drais no favours, nor did his growing sense of empathy for the proletariat, leading to his denunciation of his title and growing rift with society in general. An eventual death in poverty in Baden in 1851. Coincidentally, he died 2 blocks down the road from a then 6-year-old Carl Benz. Dryce's ideas would be picked up, however. In 1839, it's alleged a Scottish inventor named Kirkpatrick Macmillan invented a mechanism allowing riders to pedal a velocipede. In 1863, a French blacksmith named Ernst Michaud did away with the Flintstones motion by adding a rotary crank with 2 pedals to the front wheel of a velocipede, creating the world's first modern bicycle. While these bikes were popular at first, in 1868 in the USA it was noted a few coachmakers began mass-producing bikes. Young students at Harvard and Yale universities fell in love with a bicycle, and riding schools popped up everywhere. The bike was still too cumbersome for most, and many cities were still unwilling to lift their bans on the bicycle. In 1871, a British engineer named James Starley innovated further by creating a much faster, lighter, more efficient bicycle. Often referred to as the Ordinary, Starley himself had named it the Ariel, but better known perhaps owing to its large front wheel and smaller back wheel as a penny farthing. If you're wondering, the big one's a penny, the small one's a farthing, just like the coins. Starley's bicycle was a big step up, in more ways than one. It spurred a resurgence in the late 1870s. The danger in taking a header to tumble head first over the handlebars still had a great many concerned. Various inventors worked to build a safety bike, which put the rider on 2 wheels of the same size and moved the gears to the back wheel via a chain. James Starley's nephew, John Kemp Starley, finally broke the mould in 1885 with the Rover safety bike, the great precursor of most of the bikes we know today. Whereas much can be said about the bicycle, perhaps that it allowed women a level of freedom of movement in Western societies, which helped the first wave feminists, especially after the safety bike, coordinate better. Despite moral panics, men often claiming riding a bicycle would cause bicycle face, effectively something like telling a child not to pull faces in case the wind changed and it got stuck that way. The pioneering feminists took to their bikes. They won the right to vote, in some cases property rights, the right to their own earnings, to run their own businesses and to enter professions. One could point out bicycles led to employees being able to move further away from their places of employment, which in turn led to the rise of suburban living and all the good and all the bad that entails. You can make a point that bicycles became really popular in the 1880s. Governments finally began throwing some serious money into laying paved roads everywhere. The aforementioned Mr. Benz's invention, the motor car only around the corner, and with the limitations of rail becoming apparent by this time, well, bikes literally paved the way for the later automotive boom. One could point out the story of 2 brothers, bicycle builders by trade, using their expertise to create and test an incredible flying machine at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, on 17th December 1903. One could also point out, and I'm not just saying this because this is a New Zealand podcast, another bicycle maker in New Zealand, a 25-year-old Richard Pearce, used his expertise to probably beat the Wright brothers to the punch on 31st of March 1903. I am very wary of overtelling the upside of Mount Tambora in this act, but it did create a need, and necessity being the mother of invention, we stepped up. Okay, let's make this final act a short one. To borrow from the godmother of rock and roll, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, during the year without a summer, there were strange things happening every day. During the long winter, Hungary had brown snow. Red snow fell intermittently in the north of what is now Italy. To anyone in the vicinity of the recent Australian bushfires, including New Zealanders, on the 5th of January 2020 when the sky turned an unbelievably amber hue, the sunsets of 1815-1816 were otherworldly in the year without a summer. In the northeast of the USA, particularly around New England, strange things were happening every day. Throughout spring and summer 1816, a dry fog settled over much of the area, turning the sky red all day long. Wind wouldn't move the fog on, rain wouldn't dampen it, it just hung there for months on end. On June 6, 1816, snow fell in Albany, New York, and in Dennisville, Maine, in the middle of what would usually be summer. Frost settled in the fields, particularly in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and upstate New York, ruining crops throughout the region as early as May 1816. In July, middle of summer, ice began to form in the rivers and lakes in Pennsylvania. By August 1816, frosts were killing 2/3 of the corn crops as far south as Virginia, including the recently retired President Thomas Jefferson's plantation, Monticello. This upheaval was a major push factor leading to many families packing their lives into wagons and heading for pastures new. In Norwich, Vermont, the Smith family, previously of Sharon, Vermont, and struggling as it was to maintain their 100-acre farm, were driven off the land due to crop failure. Mr. Smith Sr. had set his stop-loss point at a third year of ruined crops, and the year without a summer obliged. By March, her apricot trees had been hit by a heavy frost and all the crops were wiped out. The Smiths headed for Palmyra, New York, a 300-mile journey in the middle of the summer snowstorms. One of the Smith family, Joseph Jr., hobbling all the way on crutches due to a bone infection caught several years earlier. Now, I'm not going to explore this one terribly much further, truthfully. It's always been supposition a year without a summer had a massive impact on the young Joseph, and the turn he would make a little later in life. Just imagine if the world suddenly turned surreal and you were religiously inclined. Imagine you weren't terribly religious, but lived in a time when science could not explain the eschatological weather raging across the world. Or something like the year without a summer may just provide you with your Damascene moment. The Smith family made their way down to Palmyra, in the midst of an area which became known as the Burned-Over District, a collection of towns in the west of the state, which became populated by a great many evacuees from New England, whose farms had failed, and who had divergent religious beliefs to begin with. It became a hotbed in the years following for what came to be known as the Second Great Awakening, a radical, largely Protestant religious revival in the area. Joseph Smith was a little different from these groups. In the spring of 1820, Smith would later claim he was wandering through a place he would later name the Sacred Grove. He was wondering just which newfangled religious group he should join when he claims some great evil nearly overcame him. But literally, Deus ex machina, God on a wire. God and Jesus flew down from the heavens to tell him not to join any of them, because they were all fakes. Of course, in 1823, an angel named Moroni apparently flew down to tell him of a new Bible he himself must bring into existence, via a golden book, a magical breastplate, and magic stones which had been buried in a hill, conveniently near his home. This Joseph Smith, fifth son of Joseph Smith Sr., charged over his life multiple times for dishonesty offences and disorderly behaviour. This man who conspired to murder a Missouri governor, and who would meet his own end being shot to death by an angry mob while held in jail for treason, would go on to create the Mormon Church. Perhaps I've not dug deeply enough into this man's writings to say Smith himself listed 1816 as an influence on his philosophical outlook, but one has to wonder. Many have wondered. What can be said for certain is the resettlement caused by Mount Tambora in the northeastern United States created an enclave of religious radicalism, from which the Church of Latter-day Saints emerged, among many others. Okay, folks, that's the episode. Look, the podcast will be back in 2 months' time while I write the next season. Get some incidental music for the show. I've felt that it needs a little bit of background music. And start promoting this season. I just haven't had time to advertise it on Reddit or any of the usual places. In the meantime, I have 2 months' worth of weekly blog scheduled to publish every Tuesday at 10 a.m. New Zealand time at historyandimagination.com. That is historyandimagination.com. So the material will keep coming in one form or another. As always, thanks for tuning in. If you like this episode, please share with anyone you think will enjoy the show. Please share and help get this channel growing. As always, music by New Zealand heavy rock group Ishtar. Hope to see you all again soon for more tales of history and imagination. Season 2, 8 weeks' time without fail. See you back then.
On and on, we're rolling. Time orphan sent out in the world, abandoned. Do with me what you may somehow.